Hello, welcome to Finding Your Caribbean Ancestry. The first steps that you need to take are to find out what is in the home. You need to start off with what you know and trace back to what you don't know. And the first place to start are things in your home. Have a look for certificates, birth, marriage and death, membership certificates, all sorts of other things that give you an idea of where people were born and where they came from and the dates. Have a look at letters, official and unofficial. Have a look for insurance policies that will give you addresses. Have a look for photographs and also for objects. All the objects in your home will have a history. Who gave them to someone? What did they signify? Were they anniversary presents? You can find all sorts of things that will not only help you to reconstruct your family tree, but will set off ideas and memories for you and other people in your family. So the next step, once you've had a look for all these objects in the home, is to interview your relatives, because it's a lot cheaper getting this kind of information than paying for a lot of certificates and other things. So the things that you need to look for here are the names and the nicknames. Very often people will have gone through their whole lives with a different name from the one that's on the certificate, and this can confuse you. Have a look for events and dates and get family stories. You needn't publish all of them, but it's just quite interesting to know the family background. Have a look for places where people lived and worked, because those may give you other records to look for. And also get the names of other contacts, other relatives for you to contact. Now, you may have found in the house various birth, marriage and death certificates, but once you've interviewed your relatives and you've started to sort of draw up the first family tree, you will realise that there is a lot more that needs to be done, and you need probably to establish the facts through official certificates. You can get these now mainly online. Birth certificates give parents, marriage certificates give the names of both parties, but also the names of the father of the bride and groom and their occupations, which may give you further clues and further places to look. Death certificates, when you start out, are a lot less useful usually. They give the place of death, the cause and the name of the informant, but very often this might be in a hospital, not a member of the family, but some official. So think about whether you really need a death certificate. They're quite good sometimes for addresses, but again, if someone dies in hospital, that won't help you. So once you've got your certificates, you can start constructing the family tree. And you will also at this point realise that you may have to go back to the Caribbean at some point. Well, you will go back to the Caribbean at some point. These certificates will give you gaps where you realise that the person must have arrived before or after an event. So when you're looking back to the Caribbean, you need to find out how your ancestor got here, where they were from. You may already know this from your relatives, but in some cases you may not know for some branch of the family. Ships' passengers' records are held in the National Archives, and a lot of them are now online, like the Emperor Windrush, the first of the sort of major ships coming in 1948. That complete list is online on the National Archives website. Others are, of course, being put on all the time. Unfortunately, passengers are not completely indexed yet, so you need to know the name of the ship and the year of the arrival, ideally. You have no idea how many ships there were that arrived in the days before air travel was common. So only those arriving directly from the Caribbean, not those coming via Europe, are included. So you may find there is a gap in the records when someone turns up simply because they came via Europe, because it was cheaper, perhaps. and also airline passenger not included. It was rare at this time to fly because it was very, very expensive. But of course, some people did manage to through work or through business. Those, for example, who were involved with the army, the RAF or the army or something like that, may well have flown in. So once you've done this and you've got back to the Caribbean, you need to start exploring the records of the island or the territory from where your ancestors came. Now, the important thing when you're looking at records in the Caribbean are to know when the place that you're interested in became independent. It varies from place to place. After independence, they will keep all their own records. Before independence, you may find that, in fact you will find that there are a lot of copies of records held in the National Archives in Britain. So after independence, places kept their own records, but before then you may well find copies of important documents in the National Archives here, so you can save a bit of money by going to Kew rather than flying to the Caribbean. The other important date is 1833 to 1834, which was the end of slavery in the British colonies in the Caribbean. Other colonies of other powers like the Dutch and the French had different dates when these things ended. So that's an important thing again, the business of when slavery ended. And in 1807, there was the end of the British slave trade. Again, other countries which owned territories in the Caribbean had different dates for this. But all these are important when you're sorting out the kind of documents that you want to find out more about your family. So when you get back to the Caribbean, remember that records in the Caribbean, in the British Caribbean, are similar to British records. They set up the same systems there. So birth, marriage and death certificates will also be in the Caribbean islands. However, they started at different times for different territories, different islands. So you will need to check when birth, marriage and death certification started. All the British colonies as well set up similar local government records like schools, hospitals, charities, workhouses. So if you read a book about British ancestry, tracing British ancestry, you'll find that many of the similar institutions were set up in the Caribbean, so the records there will be roughly the same. They will give you an idea of what is available. The other thing that's very, very useful when searching overseas are directories, town and place directories. The British produce sort of yearbooks listing usually shops, important people in particular towns and things like that. So it's always worth checking out what directories there are for the territory or the country that you're interested in. Another very important source of events in the Caribbean are the local newspapers. And the copies of the different Caribbean newspapers may still be in the local archives on each island or at the newspapers' offices. However, the British Library newspaper library has many, many copies of its colonial newspapers, and these are being digitised and put online. At the moment, not many overseas newspapers have been digitised, but they can be ordered and sent to the British Library at Euston. So you need to get a reader's ticket, but have a look online, and if you have a look at the catalogues, you will see what newspapers there are and how to obtain them. Quite a lot have actually been digitised, and if you get a reader's ticket, you can either look at them in the library itself or, at the moment, have a look at them at home online. So that's worth thinking about, but you need to get a reader's ticket and check out on the website how to go about this. And some are simply online anyway. The Jamaican Gleaner has been online for quite a long time. So if you have ancestors there, it's always worth running names through the keyword search. The other major source of information, of course, in the islands, and this is pre-certification, but also lasts after, are church registers. These are organised by parish. There is the registers of christenings, marriage and burials. It is worth noting, though, that baptism for black people was uncommon until the late 1700s. Also, you will find in there that race was carefully recorded, that whether someone was mixed race, what percentage of white and black ancestry they had. But these are not complete. The church registers, although they're useful, in fact they're essential before certification, and are very useful afterwards, because of course people went on having baptisms, marriages and burials in the local church even after certificates were introduced. Now, parents are not often recorded for black or mixed race people, and very often masters were recorded in the case of slaves. Colour was, as I say, usually given. And what you may find useful is that the Mormon Church, the Church of Latter-day Saints, has been digitising and copying these registers for quite a long time. You can have a look on the family history, I'll take it from the Church of Latter-day Saints. The Church of Latter-day Saints has been filming registers in the Caribbean for a very long time now. They're not complete, although in fact they do have all the parish registers for Jamaica. Now they have filmed them. Some of them are being put online slowly, and you can check with the Church of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormon Church. Have a look at their website to see what stage digitization is at and where you can get the films. I happen to know that they have copies of all the Jamaica films in their office, which is in their archive, which is currently held at the National Archives in Kew. They do have a family history centre in London, in Kensington, but that at the moment is undergoing renovation. So they have a temporary office at the National Archives in Kew. They have the films there, and as I say, I know they have all the Jamaican parish films there, and you can check which other ones they have. If they have, if one of the registers that you're interested in for one of the smaller places is not on there, is not being kept there at the moment, they can order it for you from the Central Repository in America. You have to pay a small fee, but just to let you know that you can do this, and you can do this at the National Archives in Kew. So church registers, as I say, are very important before certification. And of course there are loads and loads of other records for all aspects of people's lives. Those who served in the armed forces, all those records are not necessarily kept locally because they worked for the government, the British government. All the records of the armed forces in the West Indies are actually in the National Archives at Kew. Also, there are a lot of land and property records, deeds and such like, ownership, businesses and things like that. Those will probably actually be in the local record office in the islands. They won't be at the National Archives because those are private documents. Employers, again, those will be at the record office, and there are often private papers as well. Now, the workhouse records will be in the record office on the particular islands, and also the hospital records will be there too. But as I say, the armed forces records are in the National Archives in Kew. Now, it's worth noting also that I mentioned land and property. The deeds recording these are in the different islands' record offices, but there is a project at the British Library, the Endangered Archives Project, to digitise a lot of these books and deeds. And I happen to know that they have done St Vincent, which has a particularly well-preserved collection. So those of you with ancestors in St Vincent may find the digitised deeds records on the British Library site useful. Now, it's also worth remembering, for those of you with African Caribbean ancestry, that there were a lot of Africans in the various Caribbean islands who arrived after 1834 and the end of slavery there. So they may not have been originally in the Caribbean. They may have arrived after. There were quite a lot of free Africans who came from Sierra Leone, Gambia, and also, once slavery had been abolished in the British territories, a lot of slaves in other territories, like Cuba, tried to escape, and did escape, to the British Islands. So you may find an ancestor who arrived after 1834 from another island. There were also recruitment schemes after 1834, and free African Americans. Many of those arrived here too, and as I say, fugitives from other islands. So it's worth bearing in mind that those of you who have African Caribbean ancestry, they may not have been there before 1834 and enslavement. And of course, after 1834, other ethnic groups arrived in quite large numbers, Indians and Chinese. And it's worth realizing that they don't have European methods of keeping records or recording ancestry, but you may well find members of these ethnic groups in your ancestry. Now, when you're tracing your family, it's always a bit of a problem with surnames. Before 1834, not many had surnames. Some did, but not many of those who were enslaved had surnames. After 1834, they needed to choose one for official purposes. And it's difficult to know how those names were chosen. Some of them seem to have kept the name of their current master or a previous master, perhaps someone who had been good to them at one stage. Quite often they took the name of their current or a previous place where they lived. They took the name of a parent, becoming Johnson, because their father's name was John or some such. And quite often we simply have no idea how they chose them. They simply decided that they liked this name. So surnames may give a clue for you to look further into where people came from, but in a lot of cases you simply won't know. Now, once you get back before 1834 and starting to trace enslaved ancestors, that is more difficult. As I say, they rarely had surnames. What you may, however, find that some were freed. They could either be freed by deeds, by acts on the islands, or in their master's wills. So all these may provide a way of looking further. The problem, some of these manumissions have been uploaded online. Some of them are published, and wills, of course, are obtainable either from the National Archives or locally. Again, a lot of wills have been published, so it's worth investigating if you have some idea where your ancestor came from, where they lived, and who might have at one stage owned them. The next thing to investigate, if you find that your ancestor was freed, or even if they weren't freed, is to start looking where they were enslaved. If you can find out the name of a master or where they lived, you can start checking the slave registers. Between 1812 and 1834, the British government kept lists of slaves within their territories in the Caribbean. This was because after the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, they wanted to ensure that there was no illegal importation, that people weren't being illegally traded or sold or resold. And so at various times they made lists of all the slaves on the different islands. Now the copies of these slave registers are in the National Archives, and they have almost all of them, but it's not quite complete. Most of them are online on the Ancestry website. So those are worth exploring if you know where your ancestor came from. Even they are arranged by parish, and they're within that by estate. So even if you only know the parish and not necessarily the plantation or who the master was, they are worth exploring. You can have a look through there. You can also, Ancestry does have the keyword search. Those have been digitized, so that's worth bearing in mind. Then, of course, if you know which estate your ancestor came from, you can start looking at private records to see whether any private records from the estate have survived. There are some still in the local record offices in the Caribbean. Some may still be with the family if the family was very well established and very rich. There are also some that are in Britain because they came back with the family when they moved back after the abolition of slavery. Quite a lot did at that point because they felt there was no future for them there. And so the family may have brought them back. Now, the National Archives website has a thing called Access to Archives, which lists the contents of the catalogues of various record offices around the country. So if you put your the names of the places or the families or the people that you're interested in into the Access to Archives thing, you can see if any family records are kept in a record office somewhere in the country. Now, I mentioned wills a bit earlier. There are some held locally in the record offices on the different islands. Some have been published in books. There's a collection called Caribbeana, which was made in the late 19th, early 20th century by a member of the Society of Genealogists in London. And he went through a great deal of the wills there and recorded them. Those, as I say, are obtainable. The Society of Genealogists now has them on microfilm. Also, Caribbeana itself has been republished in facsimile form, so it's worth checking to see if a local library has it. And wills may well be also in the National Archives online. If someone owned property in more than one place, if they owned property in Britain and in the Caribbean, they had to have their wills proved in London. So these wills are all now online on the National Archives website. It's worth running the names of territories through. You can run Jamaica through, and actually you get hundreds. But if you come from a smaller territory, it's worth running the name through there just to see what wills there are from that place. So I think that's a sort of rough guide to how to start looking for your family history, the various pointers to this. There are a number of books that you can look at in your local library. There are a number of guides online. The National Archives has various readers' guides online to help you find records in the Caribbean. And all I can say now is good luck.